Hello everyone and welcome back to the Protestant Education Channel. Today we're going to be talking about Calvin's Geneva, which is often referred to as the Protestant Rome, and it set up the basis for many Protestant societies that would follow all across Europe. So let's start off by talking about who John Calvin was. John Calvin was a Protestant reformer, and he's usually associated with the Presbyterian and Dutch Reformed denominations. They follow his institutes as their own kind of catechism, if you will. Calvin came into Geneva in his late 20s, and along with William Farel, they sought to reform not just religion, but also culture, politics, philosophy, and industry. John Calvin wrote Calvin's Institutes, which functioned as the first real, what we would call now, systematic theology. And it outlined Protestant theology. So let's talk about Geneva before Calvin got there. So since 1154, Geneva had been under the rule of the Holy Roman Empire. And under the Holy Roman Empire, the quote-unquote leader of Geneva kept switching hands. The most consistent period was under the Savoys. And it was under the Savoys for a while, and then they lost power in the 1500s. Many citizens of Geneva started making other allies and pushing back against this rule, the rule of the Savoys, that is. And by 1536, Geneva had become a republic, and the main religion had gone from Catholic to Protestant. While there had been many examples of Catholic and Orthodox societies, the Republic of Geneva would be the first Protestant one. And everyone was kind of trying to figure out how Protestant theology fits into society and politics, especially since we Protestants believe that the church is tied to its nation. Most of us do. And it's under this background that Calvin and friends come in. They weren't elected officials, nor were they really politicians in the traditional sense, but they were ministers who worked with the magistrates of Geneva to bring about the reforms they sought. Calvin loved structure, and he brought this into everything, most prominently his theology. I would say Calvin is the clearest refutation of the modern notion that Protestants don't really have ecclesiarchy, or we don't really care about church polity. Calvin set up 4 roles in the church, each with different functions. Elders, whose role was to correct and discipline, and these would also be called presbyters. This is where we get the name Presbyterian from. The pastors, whose role is to preach the word, administer the sacraments, offer spiritual guidance to the congregation. Teachers, whose role was to more systematically and rigorously teach theology. And then deacons, whose role was to care for the physical needs of the church. Now, Calvin split this up into 2 categories. The first category being managing resources and money, and the second category being directly aiding the poor, the needy, and the sick. So Calvin left for a short period of time, but when he came back, he set up the consistory. And the consistory is probably the most famous thing about Calvin's Geneva. So the consistory was a council of pastors and elders that handled discipline. You'd get called in for drunkenness, adultery, blasphemy, lying, or the worst crime of all, not showing up to church consistently. Now, I know today that sounds crazy, but this really wasn't uncommon in those days, especially within Catholic and Orthodox societies as well. But Calvin didn't want control. He didn't just want to control everybody. He wanted people to be consistent, hence the name, consistory. Geneva became a hub of Protestantism in this time, and many Protestants would go there to flee the Catholic persecution of them. In 1559, Calvin would help start the Geneva Academy. So now there's pastors being trained in Geneva with all of this Calvin theology, systematic theology. And all the pastors being trained there are now exporting this Reformed theology all over Europe. Calvin's Geneva wasn't just about enforcing biblical rules as rigidly as possible. Calvin also pushed for education, literacy, stability, organized charity. Calvin's Geneva was in almost every way possible all about improving the lives of its everyday citizens. And this is where people would later talk about the Protestant work ethic, which doesn't come from Calvin, it comes from Martin Luther. And the idea of the Protestant work ethic comes from the practice of monasticism within Orthodox and Catholic. Things putting monks at a higher level than non-monks. Spiritually, that is. And the Protestants kind of said, yeah, no. I believe Calvin's Geneva is a standout example of a whole society working to fulfill the biblical call to honor God in everything that we do. Now, John Calvin dies in 1564, and Geneva still stays very influential, especially with the exportation of Calvinistic ideas we just talked about. People like John Knox would help spread these ideas all over Europe, France, Scotland, and the Netherlands especially. Scotland would later on become the Netherlands would later go on to become the Dutch Reformed denomination. Not all of the Netherlands, but it would birth out of there. Calvin's Geneva prompts a lot of interesting discussion on faith and politics, as well as just faith and public life versus private life. All of these things. But I want to know what you guys think. So remember to like the video if you liked it, hit the like button twice or hit the dislike button twice if you disliked it, and subscribe for more. I can't wait to see you guys in the next video. God bless.